Well, good morning, Eastview. It's great to be here on Vision Sunday, and isn't it wonderful to have a guest speaker come in that can speak on outreach and make you all feel really, really guilty and squirm in your seats. Well, let me just share with you from the very get-go, this idea of outreach is something that we all struggle with. It's something that we're all really, really weak in. Pastor Bert Parsons said that he loves singing "Jesus Loves Me" to his children. He says, but I've always struggled singing the phrase, "Little ones to him belong. They are weak, but he is strong." He says, because I didn't want my little children to ever grow up thinking that it was only weak when you were little. We're all weak. We're all frail as we come to this aspect of outreach. And can I just say, having been to New York City for 30 years and had thousands of people go on the mission trips, that we as the clergy don't have it down. I've been able to observe folks like you in the pew who do it far better and can connect far better than I ever could. And so we want to start out today by just saying we're all in the same boat as far as this outreach is concerned. Now, Spread Truth Ministries, a number of years ago, produced a little booklet. It was entitled, "Is There More to Life?" I think it's a question that all of us throughout history have pondered, especially when we get the things that we think will satisfy our utopia, and it doesn't. That question rings in our mind. There's got to be more to life. Kind of like Tom Brady in 2005, having won 3 Super Bowls, and he's being interviewed on 60 Minutes, and he said basically, man, there's got to be more to it than this. To which the interviewer said, well, Tom, what do you think it is? He says, boy, I wish I knew. I wish I knew. Is there more to life? Os Guinness, who wrote the book Signals of Transcendence, whom I'm going to lean on a lot this morning because I don't know if I've ever had an original thought in my mind, but I guess there's nothing new under the sun. He says this, and I quote, "Life raises such questions to all of us at some point, and certain experiences break into our lives to spur us to question whether our answers are deep enough, prompting a search for what there's a sense of what is missing and enable something more." He says these experiences that break into our lives, that make us pause, it makes us ponder, it makes us go on a search. He refers to them as signals of transcendence from an almighty God. Now this morning, we won't call them signals. We'll call them beeps. Have you ever been in bed at night and you're getting ready to doze off, then all of a sudden you hear beep? Say, what was that? A few minutes later, beep. And you're thinking, I don't smell smoke. I bet you it's the batteries in my smoke alarm that is going out. And you're hoping that that noise goes away. But it jolts you out of bed because it's going to drive you crazy unless you change those batteries. Well, beeps, as we're talking about this morning, or signals, are things that you might call a clue. It might be called an alarm. It may be called an epiphany. It's an experience that comes into people's lives that does 2 things, and you got to remember it. It punctures and it points. Doesn't give the answer. It punctures your way of thinking, your neighbor's way of thinking. That, whoa, the things that I have been thinking about in my worldview as I've been going, it just punctures it. That maybe that's not correct. Maybe what I believed is not right. And it also points. It punctures and it points. And these beeps are happening universal, all the time, in various ways. Now, if we were to say, well, can you describe a couple of them this morning? Now, these are just a couple because there's so many different ways that God sends events to catch people's attention, to catch your attention. But it could come through something that is absolutely beautiful, that stops you in your tracks. G.K. Chesterton, the famous British journalist who wrote over 50 books, I guess was a brilliant guy. They say he was giving a speech one time, and he started laughing. And the reason he started laughing was he was already anticipating a joke that he was going to tell. Can you imagine that? A brilliant guy. But grew up in an age in England when there was a lot of cynicism. There was darkness, and there was depression, and he was going down a road that he should never have been going down. And in this darkness of despair, he happened to be walking down a sidewalk, and he sees a little yellow dandelion. A dandelion that stopped him in his tracks and said, in the brokenness of this world, there also must be beauty because of this beautiful little flower here. And it set him, a dandelion, set him on a journey that punctured his worldview, that said maybe there is something more that's out there. Could be the person walking down the beach at Daytona Beach shores at sunset, and they're stunned momentarily at the beauty and think, man, maybe there's more to life. Could be tragedy. Last January, if you're watching football in Cincinnati Stadium, Damar Harlan, cornerback for the Buffalo Bills, collapses on the field. And for 9 minutes, the medics out there doing CPR to try to restore him to life, and you couldn't hear anything in the stadium. It went eerily quiet. The football world stopped, and football wasn't that important anymore. It wasn't the be-all and end-all. In fact, the ESPN announcer prays on the television. Beep, beep. And people across this nation may at that point think, maybe life is not so certain. It's brief. Am I prepared? God can use beauty. God can use tragedy. God could use what C.S. Lewis says is joy. In his autobiography, he talks about himself coming to know Christ because of this feeling, this joy, this desirable ache, this long life nostalgia that happens when you see a good movie, when you read a good book, when you love a great song. There's something that wells up in you that it's like, wow. You know what I'm talking about. And I admit I'm a little soft this morning because I hate this reveals my manhood, but I love Beauty and the Beast. And I've seen the play, I think 5 or 6 different times, being in New York City. And when you get to the end, tale as old as time, song as old as rhyme, and there's Belle, and there's the Beast, Beauty and the Beast. Man, the crowd goes crazy. They're clapping. Yeah, I love it. I'm with this or with them. Why is that? It's a beep that's pointing to something that they can't necessarily get their hands around, but it's that feeling. Les Miserables. I love it. The last scene, it's the funeral of Jean Valjean, if you've seen the movie. And the choir is singing from heaven. And it's a beautiful story of a man who's been on a lifelong journey of redemption. In a life where he thought there was no hope. They're singing, can you hear the people singing the songs of they? And the crowd at the end rises up. Yes, I love it. I'm asking you, what's going on? C.S. Lewis says it was that thing right there when he read a fairy tale, when he listened to music, or when he said, that feeling right there of joy that said there's got to be something more. But he says this, hey, listen, gang, it's not in those things to where the joy it found. It's through those things. It points to something bigger. Randy Newman says, people feel it when they see something beautiful or hear a piece of music that transports them to another world. They get a hint of it when you read a good book. You've been there. That makes you want to jump in and never return. That feeling we have, we usually notice it. That joy as it's escaping away. Lewis says it's not in those things, it's through those things. Because he said, when you go to the concert and you love it, it's really the echo of the tune you really haven't heard. You see beauty, it's just the scent of the flower that you really haven't found yet. It's news from a far country that you haven't visited. You see, if you think by reading that book and going to those concerts and going to those movies to always get this emotional high that'll somehow get you through the next day, he said it becomes a dumb idol. It's only through those things, and it was through the beauty that C.S. Lewis experienced, the joy, and the reading of fairy tales. Look at the discussion that he and J.R.R. Tolkien had about fairy tales, and Lewis is saying, well, no, they're not really real, and Tolkien says, no. Mispoint to the reality. And why do we have this feeling? And they all lived happily ever after. Beep. It can come through beauty. It could come through tragedy. It could come through joy. Something that stops you in your tracks. Something that could be big. It could be small. Something that's individual. Something that's worldwide. In your community. In your neighbors. The people at work. God is sending signals and beeps. And if they're listening, it'll puncture their view for a moment. And it'll point. It's our responsibility to come along and lead them to where that is pointing. Now, why do we and maybe our neighbors not often hear the beeps? It's because we're distracted. We got so many things going on in life, don't we? Life takes over. Work, entertainment, education, just the busyness of life, and we get really distracted. Or we're distracted by a philosophy in the world that says, this is all there is. There's no supernatural. There's no transcendence. And I'm going to just live in the world that I'm in. And nothing's going to bother me. Socrates talks about this in referring to Plato's cave. In the story, the famous parable of Plato's cave is that 5 men are prisoners inside of a cave. They're chained there. And there's a fire behind them. And so the only reality that these guys see in the cave is the shadows that are in front of them. That's the only reality they know. This is the only world they know until one escapes. And he goes outside the cave and he finds out there's sunshine. There's warmth. There's beauty. He goes back into the cave and tries to tell us, hey folks, you won't believe what's outside this, and they're incredulous. Because this is the only reality that they've chosen to believe. And that's the world in which we live. Naturalism says you're an accident when you began. And when you die, you just die. Is that all there is, my friend? Well, let's just keep dancing. Is that all there is? God is sending signals, beeps, that are puncturing their thinking, that points them. And on Vision Sunday, as we try to reach McLean County, we need a whole mass exodus of people who are willing to leave the cave and meet the person of Jesus. There's more beyond what they think in this world. So the challenge before us this morning is to show them, as William Wordsworth said, worlds unknown. And that's where you and I are able to get involved. And the good news, God is on the move, and he's not very far away. So this morning, let me share this with you as we get into this passage here. Let me just share with you that my dad, who passed away a few years ago, He loved going to New York City, went there 17 or 18 years, and he said to me, Jerry, when you go to New York to share the gospel and you talk to people, just be assured that Jesus has already been there in their life before you get there. So God's on the move. He's signaling people. He's beeping. He's already been there in your neighbor's life in one way or another before you ever got there. But this passage in Acts 17 is amazing because it's the Apostle Paul. He happens to be coming into Athens by himself. And as he walks in there, he's quite the versatile evangelist because he starts off speaking in the Jewish synagogue, and then he walks, and the Bible says, into the agora or the marketplace and talks to whomever happens to be there. And you talk about a secular town. This town had more idols than there were people. And so he's going to have to start at the beginning of the story because they didn't have the background. They didn't understand who Jesus was, these Athenians. And so he begins to deliver a sermon starting with creation. And as he goes throughout the sermon, you'll see on the slide here in verse 26 and 27, it says this. From one man, he's saying, and that's Adam, he has made every nation of men to live all over the earth. That's Bloomington Normal. And has determined there, here we go, appointed times and boundaries of where they live. For what reason? So they might seek God. Perhaps they might reach out to him, though he's not very far from each of us. So let's take a walk this morning out of this auditorium. And let's go to your neighborhood. I want you to look down the street. Think with me now of all the houses that are on your street, or maybe it's in your dorm, the doors that are on the hallway, or apartment complex, or maybe it's the place where you work, or the school that you attend. The people that are there, God says, are there at a certain appointed time, 2023. And they're living in this particular area, Bloomington Normal, McLean County, for one reason. Oh, they think they just put their stuff in the Ryder truck and moved here for a job. God says, it's much bigger. They're there so that they might seek God and possibly reach out to him because he's not very far away. And who has he placed there? You and me, to share with them the good news of Jesus. Her name was Jenny. She grew up in a home where religion was a part of her life. If it was brought up by there at the table, her dad would pound his fist on the table and he would shut down the discussion. Her mom was kind of a part of the New Age movement even back in the 1960s. So when she went off to college, she says, hey, listen, I think I need a summer job, and what I'll do is I'll try this thing they had advertised about modeling. Little did she know that this would explode, and she would become a top model and eventually move to New York City in a beautiful apartment on the east side. In fact, she's going to change her name. Her name is now going to be Windsor Elliott. And in the 1960s in New York City, it was the height of glamour. And so Windsor's life was full of parties and photo shoots, advertising different cosmetics, being on the cover of Vogue magazine. She ends up getting engaged to a baron who was her photographer, and they would crisscross the Atlantic, doing photo shoots and attending all types of parties. But there was one weekend, beep, that's going to change her life forever. And it's not going to be through beauty, nor tragedy, nor joy. It's through a cheetah. On this particular weekend, the party was taking place at a famous surreal artist, many of you have heard of him, Salvador Dali. And at these parties, there were people in attendance that, like the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Pablo Picasso, the Rothschilds. It was glamour. The men there were all decked out in their gold Nehru jackets. And the women had the long flowing kaftans, gold embroidered. But what struck Windsor was not the beauty of how people were dressed, but Salvador Dali walking around with a gold leash and a pet cheetah. Now, this pet cheetah had been declawed, it had been defanged, it had been de-everything. She said she felt as if she was suddenly looking to an abyss of absurdity and meaninglessness. She said this animal is just a caricature of what it was really created to be. But as she looked around and saw everybody decked out, she said, so is everyone here. And she set out that day to find the meaning of life. She goes back to New York City, tries all types of crazy things, mediums, didn't satisfy until one day walking down Park Avenue, she says, God, if you exist, I can't find you. But if you exist, will you find me? And I won't be like Paul Harvey. Real quickly, I'll tell you the rest of the story. A few months later, some friends of her mother, who neither one of them really knew, wanted to come by and see them. They walk into Jenny's or Windsor's apartment, and as any good mother would do, she pulls out her portfolio and showing all the magazine covers. Windsor gets ready to leave, and all of a sudden there's a gasp. Windsor turns around to the couple and said, why are you gasping? She says, well, ma'am, 6 months ago, my wife and I were on our way to a Bible study in Seattle, Washington. And we stopped by the grocery store. And we saw a magazine cover with your face on it. We said, we need to get this magazine cover here. And we need to just pray for this girl that she comes to know Jesus. Beep. And the rest of the story? Well, Windsor's really named Jenny. Jenny Guinness, the wife of the famous apologist Os Guinness, who many of you know. If you want to see a YouTube, say, look at it, it says the cheetah who changed for me the meaning of life. Jim and Susan McWilliams, dear friends, he grew up not in a Christian home, and in a most unusual way, the beat came to him. He was a partying type of guy, living in Canada, loving going back to the dorm, I'm sure, drinking beer and watching hockey. Well, when he got to school, he met some girls and he wanted to kind of get one of their numbers. And so he got their number, called her up, they went on a date, and he realized this is not the girl that I thought I was supposed to be meeting. But they began to date a little bit, and she came to the conclusion, you know what, this guy doesn't know Jesus. I need to break up with him. At the same time, he's going back to his dorm one evening. He says and I'll quote him, he says it was a wild place. He goes in and they're watching a movie in the common area where they should be drinking beer. He says, hey guys, let's turn this movie off and let's watch the game. They said, no, we're really interested. He said, quote, there couldn't have been a more unlikely scenario than a bunch of guys sitting around on a Saturday night watching a movie on the story of Ruth. He says, it was a strange moment. He said, I'll sit down because I want to be alone. He sat down and God began to work in his life. And he goes back to his room, beep, beep. He said, hey, God, I need a redeemer. Will you come into my life? They've been married 47 years, been on mission trips. So he can use a cheetah. He can use a 1960 version of the story of Ruth. Or in Washington Square Park, which is kind of infamous, to the famous Nikki Green on our New York City mission trip, the only person I know of that can take a young convert and baptize them in 2 inches of water in the fountain. But this past July 21st on a Friday afternoon, my wife and Jackie are going down the parkway there in Washington Square Park, and we've added a question connecting with signals. We said, hey, listen, has there anything ever happened in your life, as you're going through the questionnaire, that the only thing that maybe you can kind of connect it to is something divine? And the guy goes, yes. And they said, well, when? He said, right now. I was sitting here on this bench, and I said, God, can you bring somebody into my life? Beep. And Isaiah came to know Christ as a Savior. The beeps are going out all over the world in all different types of forms. And I'm here to tell you that some are listening. Some are listening. And I want to challenge us all this morning to be people that will help lead them to where the beeps lead. I want to encourage you to be a good neighbor. As these things are happening in people's lives, be kind and gracious and understand that every one of these people that you're talking to are people who have been stamped with the image of God in their life. By their compassion, their courage, their love, their work ethic, their parenting, they reflect the Creator. In fact, as Tim Keller says about New Yorkers, he says, when you go to New York, you'll find people that are kinder and deeper than you are, and they don't know Jesus. And he says, and you need the city more than the city needs you. Walk into your neighborhood. There'll be people, guess what? That can be a better parent than you. They may even be kinder. I got neighbors that are kinder than me. And though your neighborhood needs you, you need your neighborhood. Be a good neighbor. Be intentional. Again, I'm not trying to set up us as an example. My wife and I are now around more unbelievers than we've ever been in all of our life. So we're going to have donuts and coffee in our cul-de-sac on Halloween. Jeannie's going to be joining the book club. We're going to have people over to our house at holiday seasons, COVID or not COVID. You're going to take people out to eat. They're not projects. They're people. So be a good neighbor, be intentional, and make Jesus beautiful. Dr. Tim Keller passed away just recently. And there was a man named Tim Clark who was scared, kind of nervous to meet Tim. And he wanted to finally meet him. And when he finally got there, he said, Tim, I just have one thing to say to you, is that you made Jesus beautiful to me. And he looked me in the eyes and his gentle, choked up voice nodded and quietly said, that's the point. Today in this audience, some of you may be here and you've heard the beat. That's why you're here. It kind of has punctured the things you used to think about in life. But some reason you're here, and I'm here to tell you there's a reason 5,000 or 6,000 people come and they raise their hands and sing, I speak Jesus. And if you're here today and you're on that search, I say, come on and trust Jesus. You say, well, you don't know, Jerry, what I've done. It doesn't matter what you've done. Your sin is like a little tiny puddle compared to the oceans of his mercy. And if you are a Christian today, let's go to our neighborhoods and our workplaces, realizing according to this verse, they're there by divine decree. And I'll give you the quote that Os Guinness says. I think it's on the slide here at the end as I close, and let me just read it to you. He says, our privilege as Christians, by our lives as well as our words, is to help people to hear, to listen, and to understand these signals, and to help follow them where they lead. Beep. Beep. He who has ears to hear, let him hear.